On Thursday's Morning Focus, we of course heard from Molly Kelly. Molly, a mother from Kilrush, explained how she'd endured 2 hours of terror while waiting for her seriously sick daughter's ambulance. Now, we're joined by another mother from that part of West Clare. Alison Clancy's on the line to tell us about a terrifying ordeal after her 6-month-old baby suffered a severe allergic reaction, only to be told that the nearest ambulance was over an hour away. And Alison, who is a tissue viability nurse from Kilrush, is with us on the line. Alison, good morning to you and thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, Lionel. How are you? Thanks a million for having me on.
Delighted to have you on to share your story, and I guess it follows on from what Molly told us yesterday, which clearly isn't an isolated incident. So tell us a bit about your 6-month-old and what exactly happened.
Yeah, so I suppose what happened really highlights the reality of the lack of ambulance cover in West Clare. Just for a bit of context for your listeners, anaphylaxis is an allergic reaction that's life-threatening and it's time limited. So it causes airway swelling and closure, and if it's not treated quickly, it's fatal basically. So it was Easter Saturday and my baby Paddy is 6 months old. And he had just started solids, so I gave him a small amount of mashed hard-boiled egg, and within minutes he developed hives around his face. So to be honest, luckily as well, it was a Saturday, my husband was home, and as a nurse I just immediately knew it could escalate, so I sent my husband to our local pharmacist, Anthony Malone, in Malone's Chemist in Kilrush. And I suppose, frankly, my son is alive because of him. So he gave my husband a fast-acting antihistamine, which is actually the same antihistamine that paramedics would use in an intramuscular form. But so my husband went down to Anthony, and while he was gone, my son was just deteriorating rapidly. The hives were spreading. His face was swelling, his eyes were becoming puffy. It was like every second his airway was closed and his tongue was swelling to the point that he wasn't able to put his tongue back in his mouth anymore. God. I couldn't even wait. Yeah. So I couldn't even wait for my husband to come back with the antihistamine. I had to call the emergency services and spoke to the call handler, and I was told that the nearest ambulance was in Limerick. Now, I nearly died when they said it, and this just simply isn't acceptable for a life-threatening, and it's very, very time limited. Every second counts. Back in West Clare. So my husband came back and I administered the antihistamine, and it's fast acting, and that's the key that why he's alive now. So by the time he got the hives and my husband came back was a 15-minute time frame, and even with that 15 minutes I could hardly get the syringe in his mouth to pass his tongue to for him to take it. And
so sorry, Alison, that's what happened in 15 minutes, and
in 15 minutes.
Never mind, you're looking at him in one arm, and then you hear on the phone in the other the ambulance is in Limerick, and you multiply that by 4 more times how long it's going to take. Your heart must have been in your mouth.
Oh no, I nearly died, and I'm a really easygoing person, the typically Irish. Yeah, it's grand, that's perfect, thanks a million. Yeah. But I was no, I was really reiterating that his tongue is swelling, his airway is closing, and that was it. They were coming from Limerick, and I said I'm getting in the car, and she said she was advising me to stay at home and wait for the ambulance. And I said, legally, I was I understand you have to say that, but I said, I'm getting in the car and I'm going, because I had nothing else to provide my son. I wasn't going to watch him die in front of me, and I didn't know whether this antihistamine was going to actually work or not. And I had nothing, I was thinking intubation, my nurse's mode was on, we've 2 kids at home, a 7 and 3-year-old. My husband had to ring his mum to come up to mind the other 2, and literally we got straight into the car. The emergency call handler stayed on the phone and arranged a meeting point. She was very good, liaised between us and the ambulance drivers, and all I could do in the car with my son was pray that he would not die before we got to the ambulance. And so we got Lizzie Casey, the blue lights were on, the ambulance and crew were standing out. I have never been so happy to see anyone in my life than I was. Those two incredible paramedics, they were absolutely amazing, and they were actually the Kilrush ambulance crew that were there and then came back to us. So they were we were blue lighted to Limerick, and straight into triage with the paramedics, and then straight into the paediatric A&E, seen by the consultant. I'd say we'd sat down 30 seconds. But I suppose the reality of the situation is, if I hadn't a medical background and if I hadn't recognised what was happening, and if we didn't have Anthony Malone to give us the fast-acting antihistamine, if I'd waited for an ambulance at home, like, my son would not be alive today, and I just think, this is about my story, but it's really about a systematic lack of ambulance cover in Clare.
Which I guess was highlighted as well by Molly yesterday, who had to wait 2 hours for an ambulance to come to get Rhea, and even then that you've the time for the journey into UHL. Alison, in your view, are rural communities like Kilrush being left particularly vulnerable? And in all the discussion around the new hospital and hearing that they purchased the site in Limerick, did your heart sink, even with the talk of calls for an air ambulance base in your part of the county?
I just think it's shocking that we're so forgot about, and based on your geographical location determines whether you live or die, and it's as simple as that. And there's 130,000 people in Clare, and to think that there's times that there's effectively no ambulance available locally, and the A&E in Ennis was closed in April 2009, and my little man now is chiming in, aren't you, Paddy? Goodbye.
I'd say you don't mind hearing Paddy scream as loudly as possible after recent events.
He's hilarious. He's here looking at a giraffe. But there was no additional ambulance services put into West Clare, yet there was a closure of a full A&E department. You can't go to A&E, it's Limerick, obviously. So, in the situation that you have a time limited, I think that's key as well. It's there's no time. This is a severe anaphylactic reaction that there's no time. So if I had waited from Limerick, if it wasn't for Anthony Malone, the pharmacist, my son, without a shadow of a doubt, he wouldn't be here. And even I suppose the way the ambulance operation works is dynamic deployment. So that might work in cities, but not in rural areas like West Clare. So if they're deployed to bring a patient to Limerick, and then they're finished with the patient in Limerick, and then a call comes in, it's kind of you're moving around the country based on where the next emergency call is. It's not they're dropping a patient to Limerick and they're coming straight back. And the turnaround time could be a long time, by the time, probably 4 to 5 hours by the time you bring the patient, look after him, provide urgent medical care, documentation, everything. It's just hard to believe. But I suppose even it's really deeply disappointing to see that our elective Clare TDs like Timmy Dooley, Cathal Crowe, Joe Cooney, voting confidence within a government that is clearly failing our own, their own community and the people of Clare. And I'm just really blessed, really lucky. We're absolutely so grateful. But it's just a case that we are lucky. Everything aligned between Anthony Malone, the fast-acting antihistamine, driving to the ambulance, everything,
if all that hadn't been done,
the guardian angel was looking over him. But it's not right that you have a healthcare system, especially for life-threatening, time-limited, that it's just down to luck.
We know, Alison, that you're talking about where you live being a bit of a postcode lottery in terms of whether you live or die. There was a recent announcement of, increased investment, more staff for Clare, 12% expansion for ambulance cover in the county, 20 new frontline emergency care staff for Clare. Do you take any reassurance from that, or then do you listen to, like we had earlier on in the week, John McCamley from SIP2, the ambulance, the likelihood of an ambulance strike from personnel next month?
I just have so much admiration, and I would argue with anyone that they have the hardest job. I worked in ICU, have been a Beaumont, worked after the sickest, most critical patients in the country, but it's a very controlled environment, and you have backup. These people are extremely, the pressures they work under, you don't know what situation you're going out to. You have an array of symptoms, and you're trying to, assess what that could be, what to give. There could be social dynamics that you have to involve around it as well. But I just think how, for them to work, for the government to allow that to happen, for these incredible people to work under, those environments, and those, even the call that they got and they were rushing from Limerick back to us. I can imagine what was going on in their heads on, okay, we need to have this ready, this ready, this ready, this ready.
Yeah.
And they're doing, it's a system failure. We have a complete system failure in West Clare where we don't have enough ambulances, and if it wasn't for luck and the stars align in our situation, we would be in a very devastating situation.
But then, Alison, what do you do going forward? As you say, the stars aligned in this instance is, it sounds from Paddy in the background there like he's full of vim and vigour again. But, is there a possibility that a situation involving anaphylactic shock could happen again? And given what you went through and how lucky you and he were, what do you do going forward? Do you think about moving closer to UHL? Do you hope that there will be, an air ambulance base set up in your part of the county? But even so, if that happens, if there's a couple of incidents at a similar time, resources could be stretched there. How do you view the future?
I suppose it really, makes you deeply feel how isolated we are and how far back we are. Because we're very fortunate. We live in an amazing, beautiful part of the country. We have a beautiful lifestyle. Our kids are very lucky. But when you get to the point that your son nearly dies because there's no ambulance cover within a county, I suppose it really hits hard that we are really in rural Ireland. But I just hope that the government, I suppose, relies and that we're not forgotten about, and there's situations that there's no waiting, there's, you absolutely, you cannot wait.
You say you hope, Alison, but we know in all likelihood it looks like a new hospital is going to be in Limerick and near University Hospital Limerick. But on the flip side of that, you get the expansion of cover for the ambulances in Clare. Will that suffice for you?
You see, you're with the government. I think it's just. I suppose you're probably talking to me at a bad time now, because I suppose there's a lot of, it's very hard when you see your baby dying in front of your arms. We're so left behind. The hospital closing, the A&E closing, in 2009, and no additional compensatory services put in place. And I think that's what more ambulance, the choppers, and an A&E for the people of Clare, that we have somewhere to go. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just really disappointing that we're this, you wouldn't have the county without a fire engine. Yet we have the county without an ambulance cover. And that's a system failure.
Yeah, and as we've heard from you and Molly, and I'm sure there are others out there as well, these aren't isolated incidents, and you thankfully thank that the stars aligned in your instance, and glad to hear from Paddy there that he's
smiling up.
He's smiling. He's obviously a fan of Morning Focus. That must be it, Alison.
Absolutely, yeah.
Look, thank you so much for coming on, sharing your story. Glad to hear it all worked out, and hopefully something like that won't crop up again. And I guess it also highlights the how amazing having your local chemist, your local pharmacist.
If it wasn't for Anthony, my son wouldn't be here. Yeah, without a shadow of a doubt.
Well, shout out to him, and I'm sure he appreciates that you've mentioned that as well.
Him. Yeah, I need to find out what he drinks to get him a bottle of wine or something.
He'll appreciate that. No problem, Alison. No problem at all. Glad to highlight it. Alison Clancy there, clinical tissue viability nurse at Primary Care for Clare, with us on Morning Focus.